Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 17. I am the show's host, Kyle, and I'd like to start off by apologizing about last episode. If any of you listened to it, the episode was only about 13 minutes in length and then abruptly cuts off at the end. Somewhere in the editing and uploading process of the podcast I made on Monday, half of the show got lost. Not sure how it happened, but the audio is gone, so I can't just release that, unfortunately. So my plan for today is to start off the show by talking about the terror war, and I'll probably end up naming this episode part 2 of episode 16, since I did talk about some of the underlying issues about who's winning the terror war, but I didn't really get to the point where I want to evaluate it. So I'm going to start out today's show by talking about that. In the future, if this mistake ever happens again, send me an email or something, and I could try to get the problem fixed as soon as possible. I honestly didn't realize it until I looked at the file this morning, because I was sending it to someone, and I was like, why is it only 13 minutes? So then I looked at the podcast feed, and now I realized it was a mistake. So, alright, hope everybody's enjoying the show. For all of you who are listening and like the show, I say please share it with your friends, family, whoever. I recommend sharing maybe episode 15 and episode 17, but not episode 16. Hopefully this one comes out pretty good. Alright everyone, so let's get into our talk about the war on terror. The first, kind of where I was going with the conversation I was having before is just how much dangerous and how much worse jihadism is in the world today compared to the world in 2001. I guess I would like to say, kind of picture yourselves being back in 2001 and they're talking about bombing Iraq and Afghanistan, and I wasn't that old, so I didn't have such a firm political position on it then, but it seemed to me that a lot of people thought that jihadism, Al-Qaeda, was a danger to the United States, and people who believed like Al-Qaeda people need to be killed because they're an existential threat to the United States. Whether it was because people believe they attacked us for our freedom motto or whatever other reason, maybe just if they did it once, they're going to do it again kind of thing. Some people, have a pretty secure personality and they like to be very, very secure. And so, something like 9/11 would certainly scare them and threaten them. And so I think if you're living at this time, and you want to say 15 years later, 16 years later, what should the terror war look like if we won? You would want there to be fewer attacks on America and Western countries. You would want to see the total number of jihadists, so people who believe like bin Laden dead. You would want to see Al-Qaeda operating in less countries and in less regions around the world. And you would also want to see a more stable Middle East. Because, one of the reasons why we heard why the terrorist attacks occurred was because there was instability in the Middle East, and this was something that was something that America objectively had to fit, or else terrorism wouldn't get better. So I think those are probably most of the things that, like I said, America in 2001 saying this is a successful terror war. All right, so if we go to the first one, certainly the frequency of attacks in America has increased. I guess it's a little bit debatable on the severity and the amount of problems it created for America, but you certainly have the same problem. You have a bigger problem than you had on 9/11 about terrorism having the desired effect for the terrorists on the American people. If you're a jihadist member, your goal is to get Americans to hate, I don't know if you want to say Islam necessarily, but you definitely want to say you want Americans to go to war with the Middle East. Like, this is what bin Laden wanted. He wanted America to go to war in the Middle East, so the country would become bankrupt, and then America could no longer interfere in Al-Qaeda affairs. And so ridding the world of superpowers would make it easier for Al-Qaeda to grow in the eyes of Osama bin Laden. And so what he wanted to do was to provoke America into war, and that's what he did in 9/11. And so if you look at, we had quite a bit of debate leading up to the war in Afghanistan, a lot of debate leading up to the war in Iraq. It wasn't very difficult for America to go to war after 9/11, but it was debatable. Now we have situations in America where the American people simply let the federal government go to war wherever they want. No declaration of war, no authorization of use of military force was ever issued from Libya or Syria or Yemen or Somalia all countries where the U.S. is really active overseas. No congressional authority was ever given to Barack Obama to fuel an overthrow of the government in Honduras. All of these things, came about under the Obama administration. Also under the Bush administration, we have the U.S. kind of plotting in Georgia to break that country further away from Russia. You have the U.S. government overthrowing an elected government in Ukraine and putting in place a more NATO-backed government. And so with all these interventions since 9/11, you could kind of clearly see that the U.S. government has more power for war. We continue to spend money on war. We have Trump who's going to increase the Defense Department budget. And if you're increasing your Defense Department budget, that's because you're afraid of something. And so the terrorists are creating a lot of fear in America. People who are afraid are also willing to give up more freedoms. And while I don't think Osama bin Laden necessarily cared about America becoming a police state or anything like this, you can see that I'm sure it's something that he would have enjoyed. Who doesn't want to see your enemy suffer? And in his eyes, the American people were his enemies. And so we have mass spying from our government, and people are just okay with this. We have incursions on our Second Amendment rights, our Fourth Amendment rights, and this is all because, well, what if a terrorist attack happens? What could we have done to stop it? You can't even go on an airplane now without giving the government the right to really search your entire body in a very intrusive way. You can no longer enter the country with your personal electronic devices without having them searched by Border Patrol. And so, again, on this standard, Americans are more afraid and they're more willing to give up their freedoms. The final example of this, I would say, would be the election of Donald Trump, the border wall, and the Muslim ban. All these are happening because Americans are more and more afraid. I think maybe Muslim people wouldn't be the right term, but definitely of extremists. And because there is the Islamic extremists, as the Republicans like to call them, I would say jihadists. Every American is afraid that if we open our borders, we're going to get bombed for it. And while this is the complete backwards thinking that you need to have, because the problem is we're dropping bombs on other countries, that's why there's a risk in America. American people certainly don't seem to understand this more nuanced point and are just, just because ISIS is so brutal, they have the opinion that, well, while I want to help my neighbor, I'm not going to take a chance of inviting somebody into my house who could be a suicide bomber. And so, it really depends on your political affiliation and how you look at the issue, but you cannot deny that a lot of people in America are afraid and have this opinion because they're afraid. And so, if once again, when you look at the purpose of the terrorist attacks to create fear in America, you certainly have to say after 16 years of the terror war, Americans are more afraid now. The second thing you would like to see is a reduction in the number of jihadists. The attack happened because there were a bunch of people in some hills in Afghanistan that hated Americans, and they believed in an extreme version of Islam, and that made them hate Americans. And this is what Americans believed on 9/11. And so, because these people had these beliefs, they were an existential threat to America. No matter what we ever did, the terrorists were always going to be a threat to us. Now, I'm not saying this is accurate. I'm not saying I really endorse this belief. I don't think, I believe in the principle of blowback, and that it's our actions overseas that create people who hate America so much that they want to bomb us. And maybe they rationalize that hatred using a religion, but the problem isn't that there's Muslim people coming to attack America. The problem is that the U.S. dropped bombs on so many poor babies that there are people who could hate America so much that they will want to bomb us. And so, this is essentially the problem. And if you look at between now and 9/11, if there are more or less of these people who are willing to blow themselves up to get back at Americans, the answer is a lot more. On 9/11, the number of Al-Qaeda guys in the world was about 400. I've definitely heard from everybody that the number was somewhere in the hundreds. Next time I hear a source on that, I'm definitely going to cite it for everyone. That way, I believe Scott Horn recently did an interview with maybe an ex-CIA analyst or somebody of that nature. Her last name was Stoner, I believe, and she mentions that the number was really low. So you have less than 1,000 on 9/11, and if you're an American, you would say, I want less of them. If you have less, it's a victory. If you have more, it's a loss. And if you look at the world now, there's certainly tens of thousands of these guys out there, I would imagine. I don't know how many ISIS guys are left in existence, maybe a few thousand. There's certainly Al-Qaeda guys operating in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Mali, Algeria, Syria, Iraq, if I didn't name them. And I mean, they're really all over the world, right? And they blow themselves up in anywhere they could get to bomb, really, especially hitting the West's targets or Russia. And so when you look at that standard, again, if you would have told an American in 2001, hey, after 16 years of the terror war, there's going to be 20,000 jihadists instead of 1,000, I think they would say, well, this is a bad idea. So there's another one. You want to see the terrorists operating in less countries. That's number 3. And so if you look at how many countries the terrorists are operating in, it's in the 30s or 40s, I believe now. Back in 2001, it was Afghanistan and maybe Yemen. And so again, when you look at that standard, absolutely, it's a loss. It's terrible. The American people certainly wouldn't have wanted terrorists to be operating in more countries. If you told them, like I said, if you told them, there's going to be, right now there's terrorists in Afghanistan and Yemen, and we're going to put 20,000 terrorists in Iraq and Syria. Did we succeed? They would say no and laugh at you for asserting that. And then the other thing that you would want to see in 2001 compared to 2017, you would want to see more stability in the Middle East. You would want to see less places where terrorists could operate without being under the restrictions of the government. Places like Iraq, Syria, Libya, they all had a pretty good handle on their terrorism problems. Somalia even. And if you look at the world in 2017 and you see 20,000 terrorists in Iraq and Syria, and thousands more in Libya, and thousands in Yemen, and thousands in Somalia, and thousands in Afghanistan, you would say, oh, this is obviously a failure, this is obviously a terrible thing. And so with these measurements, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, I think I made a pretty strong case here that the war on terror has increased terrorism, and that an American in 2001, if they looked at the world in 2017, they would easily say that the war on terror has been an absolute failure. We're not safer today. We're more scared today. Al-Qaeda's all over the place. What are you people doing? And so, using these metrics, obviously, the American people are losing the terror war. An average citizen of America, Trump voter, a Hillary voter, a non-voter, we're all losing. We're paying more in taxes. We're $20 trillion in debt. Several thousand of our soldiers have gone overseas and died. Tens of thousands more have come back either with severe physical or mental disabilities that will impact them for the rest of their lives. You have hundreds of thousands of families who lost a loved one and maybe lost support from that person, either emotional support or financial support. A lot of women were widowed. A lot of women, were with somebody who had a bright future, but instead went overseas and now has a severe case of PTSD and is limited in what he could do because of that. Millions of people have been separated from their families for long periods of time. You've had children whose fathers or mothers were overseas, and maybe they came back and they were fine, and maybe they even got a Purple Heart when they came back, or a Medal of Honor or whatever. But at the same time, that was time that American children had to be separated from their families. If you look at just the fact that we've had so many people enlisted and so many people going and fighting, we've had some of our brightest young people spending time building weapons of war over building better energy, building better self-driving cars. There's so many really cool things we could have, but we're spending so much money on defense, and then we're also sending some of our strongest and most intelligent young people to go and produce nothing of value to the society, in the sense that they're not providing a product that makes our lives richer. In some sense, I guess, you could say, well, you need to be safe and protected. But in my last analysis of that, the American people are losing the war on terror. Our soldiers obviously aren't accomplishing that goal, as well as their intentions may be. One thing they're not doing is releasing terror, and that's not their fault. It's the politicians, it's President Bush, it's President Obama, it's President Clinton, it's President Trump. All these men have put the United States in horrible, horrible positions, and have sent our troops around the world to places they shouldn't have been. And for this reason, that these men, men and women suffer all these negative consequences. However, the troops are following orders. They believe that we need to go to war and that they need to sign up to protect their country. So I'm not trying to condemn them. I'm just saying it from the standpoint of a population as a whole. What brings more value to the population? A bomb or a new battery that holds, a little bit more energy, or a way to make solar panels or windmills more efficient? If you look at it, it's clearly the second that provides more benefit to the world. And again, that's not that our soldiers should be ashamed of necessarily. And for these reasons, when you look at who are the clear losers in the war on terror, it's the civilians of the United States. It's also the civilians of the Middle East. These people have seen their countries set on fire. They've seen the rise of ISIS, the rise of al-Nusra, the rise of al-Qaeda, the rise of al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, the fall of Gaddafi in Syria, the fall of Saddam in Iraq, the destabilization of Yemen and Somalia and Syria and Afghanistan. None of these people are living safer lives. They're not living better lives. In fact, they're doing everything they can in the world to get out of these countries, even at, great risk to their own peril. You have a situation where Saudi Arabia killed 42 refugees fleeing Yemen for Sudan. These were actually people from Somalia, for whatever reason, thought there was a better life in Yemen. I've actually read this story before, and a lot of people were concerned that this was going to make life worse for people in Yemen, because people from Somalia thought that there was a good life for them in Yemen, when sad to say, the situation in Yemen is brutal and bleak, and there's near famine, and there's bombs going off on civilians every day. And so these people got to Yemen, and they said, oh, well, we left one hell for another. And so they decided to go flee to Sudan, hoping for a better life there. And as they were crossing the Red Sea on a little dinghy, a Saudi Arabian Apache helicopter opened fire on them and killed a bunch of them. And it's a sad story, everyone. And so you have like 2 million refugees in Turkey. You have millions of refugees all over Europe. You have I guess probably 100,000 now coming to the U.S. Maybe even a few 100,000 of refugees from the war from Middle Eastern countries to the U.S. in the past 16 years or so. I'm not sure if the number's in the millions, but it would be interesting to find out. And so, certainly for all of these people, anybody who has to be a refugee, anybody who lived in a home and then had that home exploded and possibly lost family or friends in that bombing. And I'm sure that you can't throw a rock in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria and not hit somebody affected by the wars in those countries. So for people of those countries, the Middle East is obviously a worse place than it was before. And for the jihadists, they are winning. Absolutely winning. They're all over the Middle East. They got more funny. ISIS was operating oil fields for a few years. Right now, I just read a story that they're conscripting people in Mosul. So the jihadists have gotten so powerful, they now have the government authority to conscript people into their service. It couldn't be worse. It couldn't be even more of a failure in that sense, and a complete win for the jihadists. I obviously do not want them to win the terror war. I think these are, some of the worst people in the world, if not the worst people in the world. And they're winning the war thanks to the actions the U.S. is undertaking. They've manipulated our presidents to act in ways that it benefits them and puts the United States people in harm's way. The other big winners of the terror war is the U.S. government. If you look at all these senators being reelected year after year, they're living great lives. John McCain, Orrin Hatch, Lindsey Graham, Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton. These people are all on top of the world. They're getting tons of money. They got good health care, free haircuts, free gym memberships. What a life to be a politician. Huge campaign donations, money so that when you campaign, you stay in nice hotels, and puts out a ton of flyers and posters, and give your friends some nice cushy jobs so they give you some kickbacks down the line, and just making it all worthwhile. What a life that our politicians in the U.S. have. The people at the weapons industries. Nothing's better for Lockheed Martin than the U.S. dropping bombs on more and more countries. These people are benefiting. You have the intelligence, the private intelligence community. These people are making massive amounts of money off of U.S. contracts. The U.S., I think, has 3 times more contractors in Afghanistan than they do troops. Places like Halliburton and all these types of companies are making a killing because the U.S. continues to need troops overseas. And remember, none of these dollars are going to real productive use. Dropping a bomb in Syria, dropping a bomb on Iraq, dropping bombs on Libya, none of those made America any safer, and so they were wasted money, and we've wasted an awful lot of money. I mean, I detailed before about how the U.S. shot a $3 million Patriot missile at a $200 drone. Did doing that make the United States any safer at all? No, it made American people $3 million poorer. It made the politician maybe $30 richer. You know, he sold another Patriot missile, and Lockheed gives him an extra couple dollars in his next campaign check, which allows him to buy a nicer meal or spend more money on whatever campaign thing, or just, you know, siphon off the campaign money for himself. You know, these people are winning. They're living the life. They got it made because of our war on terror. And so the winners are the jihadists and the American politicians, and the losers are the people. That's the terror war for you. 16, 17 years later. All right. Just a few other stories I want to touch on that I didn't get to in my analysis on the war on terror. 3 U.S. soldiers were shot in Afghanistan. What happened was an Afghani soldier fired or mistakenly fired and wounded 3 U.S. soldiers. It didn't look like any of those soldiers were going to die from the article I read. So it's something that we should all keep an eye on, because, you know, I've talked about before the risk of these impersonator attacks where a member of the Taliban will infiltrate the Afghan police or the Afghan army, and then they're able to have weapons in the vicinity of people who support the U.S. government and the Afghani government and turn around and shoot them. And so it's a very dangerous thing, and we shall keep our eyes on when things like this happen. The other news story is that a UN report on Israel was pulled. We found out about this because a high-level UN official actually resigned over this. There was a UN report that came out that said that Israel was an apartheid state because of the way they treat the Palestinians. But before the report could be put out, some high-ranking U.S. countries put pressure on the UN to pull the report, and in protest, this woman resigned. The U.S. and the U.K. are sending troops to Eastern Europe. The UK sent their first of what will be 800 troops to Estonia. Those troops are going to be in a country that borders Russia now, and they're, you know, NATO troops sent there to, quote, combat Russian aggression. We also have the U.S. announcing another 1,200 troops. U.S. troops will go to Poland. Again, these troops are stationed pretty close to the Russian border there. I believe 900 of those NATO troops will be American troops, and the rest will be German or Romanian and British troops. I find it very interesting that they're going to be Romanian troops stationed in Poland. Romania is a country that we need in NATO because of the risk that Russia would take over Romania. But then Romania joins NATO and sends their troops to Poland. That's really confusing and an odd one. I want to talk about 1.4 million children are starving to death in Yemen, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Somalia. So in these 4 countries, there's a total of 1.4 million children that may be starved to death due to famine in those countries. By and large, those famines are mostly a result of war in those countries, and the U.S. has had a hand in all those wars. I would also just like to talk about an increase in U.S. strikes in Mosul and Raqqa. Since the start of the year, January and February, numbers put about 7,000 U.S. airstrikes on ISIS in Iraq and Syria between those 2 months. Terrible thing to have happen. A lot of those strikes are hitting Mosul and Raqqa, so, high population areas. Air Wars have seen a huge increase in the number of reports they're getting that people are getting bombed by the United States or Russia. And so this is something that we should be concerned about, keep our eyes on, and demand our politicians have some accountability for the Pentagon and the CIA dropping bombs on people like this. And once again, I'd just like to point out this has been going on since January, so this is also Obama is responsible for this as well. The only reason I mention this is because I want everybody to remember that the problem will never be solved by electing a Democrat or a Republican. Both parties have the same foreign policy. That's so bad for our country. That'll do it for the show today. If you like the show, give me a rating and review on iTunes. That would really be helpful in getting my name out there. If you like the show and would like to check out my daily news roundups, go to kylesfilesblog.com, files F-Y-L-E-S. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. Check out my private Facebook, Foreign Policy Focus. We got some awesome stuff going on there. All right, everybody, I'll see you on Friday.